The Assyrians were a great military nation, with swords red with blood and ambitions rampant and unchecked, allowing them to create one of the most expansive empires in ancient Mesopotamia. But where did they go after such success? Before Alexander the Great embarked on his quest to be the conqueror of the world, there was another empire that made the nations tremble in their homes. They could make the bravest warrior's heart turn cold with their reputation for harsh punishments for war prisoners and brutal siege warfare. But the Assyrian Empire no longer reigns over Mesopotamia. In fact, it no longer exists at all. The Assyrians did not start out as the largest group in Mesopotamia. Historians believe that the Assyrians first arrived in Mesopotamia around 2600 BCE. For about 600 years, the city of Assur, which was the Assyrian capital, was a vassal of the Akkadian Empire. Living in the shadow of the Akkadian Empire meant that the Assyrians worried about becoming slaves to this more powerful entity, but it also meant that they benefited from the trade network. They established several different trading posts and used their wealth and influence to grow. They rebelled against the Akkadians every time there was a moment of weakness, showing that even as a young civilization, they were a nation of fighters. The Assyrians were finally freed from Akkadian rule around 2150 BCE. They managed to escape the influence of other Mesopotamian tribes because the Assyrians were too far north for the southern tribes to worry about at that time. Left to their own devices, the Assyrians began to expand their trade network and establish the first borders of their kingdom. Through their trade network, they came into contact with iron, which they used to make weapons that were better than the traditional bronze weapons. There were many different competing tribes in Mesopotamia, so the Assyrians spent many years defending their territory from everyone else. It wasn't until King Adad-nirari I came to the throne in 1307 BCE that Assyria began to expand dramatically. He also introduced the Assyrian practice of deporting populations after conquering new land and harsh punishments for anyone else who resisted Assyrian rule. Although the general practice of deportation was normal in Mesopotamia, the Assyrians' use of this tactic appears to have been larger in scale and more forceful than had been seen before. King Adad-nirari I was a great military king, and he conquered nearly all of the Mitanni kingdom, which was near Assur. The Assyrian kings who followed would continue in military excellence, conquering more land and getting more resources for their growing empire. By the time King Tukulti-Ninurta I died around 1208 BCE, most of Mesopotamia was under Assyrian rule. Even the Bronze Age collapse didn't stop the growing empire for long. Several large civilizations collapsed, but the Assyrian Empire pushed through, even if it did lose some of the land it had conquered earlier. But all that changed in 1115 BCE. Tiglath-Pileser I came to the throne, and he revitalized the economy and pushed the Assyrian Empire to conquer as it never had before. For the first time, the Assyrians reached the Mediterranean Sea, and all the practice they had had so far prepared them to step into the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which historians say lasted from 911 BCE to 609 BCE. During this time, they expanded to control the four corners of the earth, making them the largest ancient Mesopotamian civilization. It was fueled by financial concerns. War was profitable, and the Assyrian kings needed funds to build large temples and palaces, and conquering more land allowed them to set up safer trade routes. The Assyrians began this task of conquering their immediate neighbors, but they soon stretched to conquer Syria, Israel, and Palestine. At this time, there wasn't any other superpower in the area, so the Assyrians went unchallenged by anyone big enough to pose a serious threat. Even Egypt could not provide strong resistance to Assyrian forces because the Egyptians were dealing with the Kush to the south. Sargon II, remembered as one of Assyria's great military kings, began conquering Egypt around 720 BCE. He was so powerful that Pharaoh Osorkon IV quickly decided to make peace with the Assyrians. Sargon II agreed to peace, and the two countries traded with each other. However, this wasn't enough for the Assyrians. Egypt was still a free country, which meant that they were free to support rebellions against the Assyrian Empire. When Esarhaddon came to the throne in 681 BCE, he decided to put an end to that by marching his army into Egyptian territory and finally bringing Egypt under Assyrian rule. Although conquering Egypt encouraged cultural developments in the Assyrian Empire, the Assyrians were not satisfied. The Assyrian Empire was the largest it had ever been, and the kings were still focusing on expanding. As they marched across Mesopotamia and into Africa, the Assyrians seemed unstoppable. So, what happened to the Assyrians? Just as they reached the height of their power, the Assyrian Empire suddenly collapsed. But why did it fall so quickly? Historians believe that the empire got too big to be completely defended, and the Assyrians neglected their unspoken agreement with the Babylonians, which proved to be their undoing. By trying to conquer Babylon, the Assyrians spent too much time and too many resources in their attempt to control all of Mesopotamia, leaving themselves vulnerable to collapse and defeat. When Tiglath-Pileser III came to the throne in 745 BCE, Assyria went through a time of major expansion. These expansions were mostly focused westward on countries like Egypt, Phoenicia, and Palestine. But some of their expansion began to encroach southward, where Babylon was. For a long time, Assyria and Babylon had had an unspoken agreement that neither civilization would meddle with the other. Both were powerful civilizations in Mesopotamia, and they had major cultural similarities that included worshiping the same gods. They were so similar that meddling with each other would probably start a war that would end with only one civilization left. By the time Tiglath-Pileser III came to power, the Assyrians had decided to take that risk. Controlling all of Mesopotamia was too tempting an opportunity not to pursue. So as Assyria expanded to the north and the west, they also expanded to the south. Tiglath-Pileser III started his reign by marching into lands along the southern and eastern borders of the Assyrian Empire. He claimed he was doing this to support the Babylonian king against enemy tribes, but he was probably also doing this to protect his own interests. A strong Babylonian king served as a buffer between Assyria and other tribes like Elam and Medes. The Babylonians didn't always appreciate the Assyrian interference in their territories, so fights had broken out about this practice before, even though that did not stop the Assyrians from interfering. In 745 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser III was pulled away from his exploits in Babylon, and while he was gone, a Chaldean named Mukunziri took the Babylonian throne. Tiglath-Pileser III was not pleased, and he hurried back, conquering Chaldean cities and eventually taking the Babylonian throne for himself. Although the Assyrians officially held the Babylonian throne for about a century, they could never fully bring Babylon under Assyrian rule. The Chaldeans seized power every time the Assyrians turned their focus to another part of their growing empire. In fact, in 721 BCE, Merodach-Baladan assumed the Babylonian throne and ruled in relative peace for 10 years. The Assyrians were busy with other areas of their empire, and Merodach-Baladan used his reign to increase prosperity and academic learning in Babylon. It all changed when the Assyrians finally had time to turn their attention back to the south. In 710 BCE, Sargon II renewed the fight against the Babylonians, and he defeated Merodach-Baladan and took control of the Babylonian throne. He intended to finally consolidate Babylon under Assyrian rule, which would cost the Assyrians dearly. The Assyrians spent the next 30 years in drawn-out military combat with the Babylonians. Although they eventually managed to mostly take control of Babylon under Sennacherib's reign, the Babylonians were bitter about the defeat, especially after Sennacherib treated them no better than any other civilization he conquered. He razed buildings, looted temples, and even destroyed their farming land by dumping the soil into the Euphrates River. The Babylonians would never forgive them for that. After Sennacherib was assassinated, Esarhaddon took the throne and immediately began trying to heal the rift between Babylon and Assyria. He rebuilt temples, reinstituted tax exemptions, and tried to restore the cultural and economic prosperity the Babylonians were used to. Esarhaddon appears to have been fairly popular. At the very least, the Babylonians did not openly rebel against him, so his reign was peaceful. As Esarhaddon was dying, though, he did something non-traditional. He named his son, Ashurbanipal, as the heir of the Assyrian throne, and he named his other son, Shamash-shum-ukin, as the heir of the Babylonian throne. Esarhaddon envisioned his sons ruling Mesopotamia together as equals. That did not happen. Ashurbanipal continued the Assyrian practice of interfering with Babylonian affairs, which angered Shamash-shum-ukin. Fighting between the two brothers erupted in 652 BCE, and this brotherly squabble became known as the Great Rebellion. The fighting dragged on for the next 7 years. Most of the major cities sided with Ashurbanipal in Assyria, but Shamash-shum-ukin had the support of Elam in the east and the Arabs in the west. Ashurbanipal would eventually put down the rebellion, but the fact that it took him 7 years shows that Assyria was already in decline. Although Assyria won, they would never again be able to embark on a major military campaign. They destroyed Elam, which eventually removed one of their protective buffers against the southern tribes. The war had also strained the Assyrian resources. The repeated campaigns in Babylon had cost too much, and while Babylon wasn't the only reason that Assyria fell, it was one of the main reasons. Understanding the Assyrian collapse is a study of paradoxes. The Assyrians needed to expand because they needed resources. They used their superior weapons and military tactics to wreak havoc on their neighbors, conquer more land, and get the resources they needed for their growing population. The problem is that as they expanded and conquered more land, they needed even more resources to take care of their ever-growing population. They had to set up government systems to collect tribute from conquered people, and they needed to maintain a strong army to defend their conquered land and put down rebellions. All of that takes resources, and one of the resources the Assyrians never seemed to have quite enough of was manpower. As the Assyrians began to fight larger and more powerful kingdoms, they had trouble securing their borders. They didn't have enough men to fight kingdoms like Babylon and keep down any rebellions in other conquered lands. The Assyrians had to choose their battles, and by choosing to fight Babylon off and on for about a century, they left themselves vulnerable to attacks in other parts of the empire. It was only a matter of time before the Medes, the Egyptians, and the Babylonians were too much for the Assyrians to fight off. As Assyria finally fell, Babylon rose up as the next powerful empire of Mesopotamia. Although the Assyrians were no longer a major player in Mesopotamia, they left their mark on history as one of the most powerful and warlike civilizations who had tried to conquer the world. To learn more about the Assyrians, check out our book, Assyrian History, a captivating guide to the Assyrians and their powerful empire in ancient Mesopotamia. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Also, grab your free mythology bundle ebook while it's still available. All links are in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.